Thanks for joining us, Mr. Dutton. I'll get to the reshuffle in a minute. I just wanted to ask first about the election defeat. How much of that defeat was about Scott Morrison and his style of leadership?
Well, good morning, Andrew. Nice to be on the show. There's a review underway at the moment that Brian Loughnane's heading for us. We'll have a look at all of that and we'll learn the lessons from the election. But look, in 1996, when John Howard was elected, the public were over, Paul Keating. When John Howard left office in 2007, they were ready to change government, and true also for Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. And after 9 years, people wanted to change as well. So that's the reality of what this election was about. The policies that we had, people weren't complaining about JobKeeper, which saved over 700,000 jobs. People weren't complaining about the national security settings that we had in place or other policies. You had 2 years of really tough times for our country, and many people are still living through that. So I think you need to accept the reality of what has been a tough 2 years for our country. The government responded as best we could, but former Prime Minister had a big number of people, including most of the premiers and chief ministers, speaking as one against him, and I think that took its toll in the end. But we'll have a look at the review, the outcome. We'll learn the lessons from that, and we'll listen very carefully to what the Australian public has said, and we'll respond accordingly.
I can understand why you don't want to criticise the former leader who's still in your party room, but I'll put it to you that he had one particular fault, and that was to be slow on things. Whether it was the vaccine rollout, even closing the international borders, he did it later than others would like. JobKeeper, he was kind of dragged to that. Rapid antigens, the same. This was a key fault of Scott Morrison that cost you in the end and cost his reputation with the Australian public, wasn't it?
Well, Andrew, I am going to defend Scott Morrison and the Morrison government. We don't trash our legacy. There's a lot that we're very proud of. But as I say, people were hurting, and their perception on some of those issues that you've just outlined might be the reality. The difficulty, of course, is that in the cut and thrust of these decisions, particularly at a time of crisis, they're difficult decisions, and quite often the decision that gets to the Prime Minister's desk is terrible, or even more so in terms of the two decisions that he or she has to decide between. So I think credit where it's due. If you look at where we are as a country compared to the rest of the world, Labor has inherited a very strong economy. They've inherited a set of numbers that they couldn't have imagined could be any better than what they are, having gone through COVID and the disruption economically over the last few years. They're out there making excuses, of course, now trying to rewrite history, and it seems to me that people like Chris Bowen are demonstrating amply their inexperience. They don't know which way to jump at the moment, and it'll take them a while to find their feet. But for some of them, as they demonstrated in the Rudd Gillard years, they'll never find their feet, and they'll always be lurching from one disaster to the next. All
right, you're into Chris Bowen, knowing he's coming up on the show next. I'm sure he's listening. Now, you've been saying that
he can respond shortly.
You've been saying this promise of Labor's to call for a minimum wage rise was a broken promise. Let me read this submission to the Fair Work Commission from the government. It says, in conducting its decision on wages for this year, the government recommends the Fair Work Commission ensures the real wages of Australia's low-paid workers do not go backwards. How's that a broken promise?
Well, Anthony Albanese, when he was asked during the election campaign whether he would submit 5.1% as the figure, he said absolutely. That was his words. There were no other words attached to it. Absolutely was a single word.
But isn't this the same? And isn't this the same effectively?
Well, if it's the same, why not put 5.1% in the submission?
Because inflation has increased past that, Mr. Dutton, perhaps? Like, the inflation is probably higher than 5.1 right now.
Make that clear. The difficulty that this government's got is that they're going to fuel inflation. And if you fuel inflation, which is what Labor does when they spend more, and they can't help themselves, it's within their DNA. So the circumstances over the next 3 years are going to be difficult economically. Already seeing gas price increases, you're seeing fuel prices hold up. the reality of Europe. The problem is not the circumstances, because there will always be difficult circumstances. It's how you respond as a government. And under the Howard government, under the Abbott government, under the Turnbull government, under the Morrison government, we were able to respond to those economic shocks with policy that provided an underpinning to the success of the Australian economy. Nobody could have imagined the growth in house prices and asset values over the course of COVID, when in most other countries, businesses have gone broke, people have lost their homes and their employment. In our country, we haven't experienced that. So it's how you respond to it. And Labor at the moment is going to spend more at a time when they shouldn't. The ratings agency has already pointed out that the AAA credit rating for our country is at risk if Labor continues to spend. They didn't provide for that spending in their pre-budget, in their pre-election figures, and they don't know how to respond to the energy crisis now. And it is going to be tougher under Labor. That's the reality, and we'll support good policy, but we are going to call out the government when they get it wrong, and they'll get it wrong regularly.
All right, Penny Wong's made several Pacific Island nation visits already. Maurice Payne didn't really do this. Was your government asleep at the wheel in terms of the Pacific?
Well, hang on, Andrew. I mean, Maurice Payne wasn't wasn't travelling because of COVID at the time. So, yes, of course, if we'd won the election, Maurice Payne would have been across to all of these countries and many more. I mean, she had an incredible work rate as the Minister for Foreign Affairs. So, the fact that people can now travel again, as we're seeing in terms of tourism and the numbers of Australians going offshore, people are bursting at the seams to get back out.
All right, well, but Scott Morrison was travelling.
That's true of ministers as well, so you've got to be realistic about it.
Scott Morrison was travelling, but where he was travelling was the US and the UK. It seems to me no one was travelling to the Pacific. Are you saying they wouldn't have let you in, these countries? Wouldn't have even let a Minister of the Crown in? No,
and we had travel. There was good engagement, and why did Scott Morrison go to the US and the UK? Well, to seal the biggest security deal in our country's history in AUKUS. It will be the underpinning of our security for decades, and of course that is of benefit not just to us, but to our Pacific Island nation, family members here, and that's the reason that he travelled, which was perfectly legitimate, and and there's heavy engagement with our counterparts. So I think good luck to Penny Wong, and we will support the government in protecting and defending our interests in the Indo-Pacific, because it is an uncertain time, but there's a long way to play out, as you know, in relation to this particular issue.
Just a couple of minutes left, Mr Dutton. I wanted to ask about the Uluru Statement of the Heart and this Indigenous voice in the Constitution. You've left the door open, but you've indicated you prefer practical reconciliation. I guess those arguing for this say it is a form of practical reconciliation. What would encourage you to support this? Because your support, obviously, given the history of referendums, is critical.
Well, Andrew, as Linda Burney's pointed out, she hasn't yet got all of the detail together. She's not sure of the timelines, and that's understandable. They're working through all of that. So the point I made the other day was I'm not ruling things in and out until I see what's being proposed. And as a shadow cabinet and as a party room, we'll have that discussion as to what our response will be to these different policy areas. But it's incumbent upon the government, you said in your opening remarks, that they are talking about trying to work with media companies, etc. To be honest, I don't think the public has a clue as to what Anthony Albanese or Linda Burney's talking about at the moment. What would it mean? What would the implication mean in terms of policy? All of that needs to be explained if the government's going to take a very significant question to the Australian people. And at the moment, I just feel there's been no ground prepared whatsoever. And no doubt the government will have that work underway, and there'll be an advertising campaign if that's what they're doing, and they'll properly explain it. But I think at the moment, most people have sort of heard the headline at best, but don't understand. And in fact, I mean, the government, I don't think, has worked out yet what the practical implications would be. What does it mean in terms of legislation, of consultation, consultation that sees a representative body elected, etc. None of that detail is available. So sure. I think we've got a few steps yet before anybody can provide a definitive response. Just a couple of quick questions now. What can you tell us about this reshuffle?
Anthony Albanese's got 10 women in his cabinet. You've only got 7 women in the House of Representatives in the Liberal Party at least. How many women in your shadow cabinet that you're announcing today?
Well, Andrew, we'll make an announcement later today. David Littleproud and I will do that because I want to demonstrate the strength of our coalition and the united nature of our party. It was important that we had the party room. Susan Lee and I were elected unopposed, and there is a desire to pull together. So you'll see some new faces. We've got incredible talent in the front bench, on the front bench at the moment, but those people that have been on the back bench for a while as well, some incredible talent. And I want to give some of them an opportunity, some new faces for the public to see, and we'll announce all of that detail. And yes, it's important for us to have as many women as possible on the front bench, and that will be a feature of the front bench that we announce later today.
And just finally, Mr Dutton, John Howard distinguished himself in opposition by supporting big reforms like the sale of the Commonwealth Bank, sale of Qantas. Tony Abbott was a different style. I'm sure you looked to both these men as examples before you. He was more of a wrecking ball, I think. He was an opposer and very effective, and it helped him win a solid majority. So what kind of opposition leader are you hoping to be or planning to be?
Well, I mean, both men have got great qualities, but we live in a different time now, Andrew, so we need to respond to the reality is that the government has a majority in the lower house. In the upper house, they rely on the Greens to pass legislation. But as I said before, if there are sensible reforms that are in our country's best interests, the opposition will support those reforms. If we don't think they're in our country's best interests, or we think that they can be improved, or that we're vehemently opposed to it, we'll be very clear about that. So, yes, we'll be constructive when it's in our country's best interests, particularly in the national security space. But we'll also, I think, on the economic front, have a very different offering to the Australian people by the time of the next election. I think there are a lot of forgotten people out in the suburbs, in the bush, in regional areas and in capital cities who don't feel represented at the moment. And I want us to be the party for them. I think the Liberal Party of Australia now is much more representative of the Australian working class than the Labor Party is. The Labor Party's drifted to the left. They're very supportive of every green policy going, and they're in a race to go to the left with the Greens. And the Australian people deserve a better choice than that, and we will provide strong policy for their consideration, and we'll point out the deficiencies, because, as I say, cost of living pressures will be higher under Labor than what they would have been under the Morrison government or under a Liberal government. And Labor's going to have to explain that and their failings, and we'll call them out on that, as an opposition should, because that's the way that you get better government.
Peter Dutton, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.